What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 33 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. I think that's kind of a milestone, but it's like not quite a third of the way to 100. So we'll take what we can get. But today we have hopefully a pretty good show for you guys. We're going to talk about, Zach's going to get pretty woo-woo on us. He's going to talk about psychological synergy of training protocols. I'm going to chat about whether you should rate RPE within a set or whether you should just kind of wait until after the set, put your coach's hat on, and then rate the RP. So we'll kind of dive into some research there. And then we have a quick listener question from Isaac lined up, time permitting. Before we get to that, if you enjoy kind of what we do on the podcast here, to kind of support what we do, you can leave us a rating on iTunes and also check out the stuff we offer in the description below. And in the description, we'll also have links to any papers that we discussed today. So with that, Zach, I'll kick it to you and you can talk about your fancy psychological stuff.
What an intro. Yeah, man, I've been thinking about this a lot, mostly through just like coaching stuff. And so just kind of to talk a little bit about what I've been just thinking about a lot is just when we, write training for any individual, kind of the goal of writing a protocol is just to give the lifter, and obviously they're going to have their own context, just the best chance to be successful at acquiring, the desired amount of training stress, whatever that is. And that's obviously a pretty broad definition. That's pretty vague, but that's kind of the point, is that, training protocols should kind of meet the individual where they're at to accomplish whatever goal you're trying to, chase after. And so, I've just been reflecting on a lot of decisions that I've been making in coaching of like what goes into selecting a quote unquote good training protocol for an individual. And I think a lot of times, when we're training for a given outcome, what we're ultimately trying to do can be really similar, but the way in which we get there can be pretty different depending on, like I said, that individual's context. So like a few things that are going to go into that I think are important to consider when you're writing training protocols. You have things like equipment. So like one thing that comes to mind there is, maybe we're, doing a strength slot, right? So the goal generally of those slots is to lift generally heavy loads if we're training for strength, and do so in a way that makes the individual feel practiced and allows them to, increase their proficiency on that lift. But, like a very common protocol you might see is, doing some sort of top set, and then maybe you take X% off the bar. One thing that's often not considered with kind of equipment constraints is, depending on the percentage drop that you're assigning, if somebody only has, certain weight increments, if they have a home gym or whatever their gym has, that can kind of, make it very difficult for somebody to adhere to that protocol strictly. And depending on how fine the weight jumps are that they have, they may overshoot or undershoot the protocol depending on how that's written. So like that's one way in which, equipment could go into that. Another thing would be, certain equipment just doesn't lend itself well to training with heavy loads. Like if you have a bench setup that's just kind of jank and the J cups are really weird or something like that, and you often can't get a spotter, maybe that doesn't allow you to go as heavy at that gym on bench press, just things like that. Obviously there's a lot of instances in which that could be something to take into account, but I think equipment broadly is something to consider. Another one is like time availability. Again, even if we're trying to go after a similar goal, some protocols are simply just going to require more time than others. And that, can be something to take into account. It's really, what requires more time, I think, is going to be pretty individual, because some people, enjoy certain things and go faster, like maybe working up to a top set takes some people not very long because they're really excited to get there. Whereas other people, it takes them a really long time to warm up to that. So exactly what causes greater time constraints, I think, is super individual, but ultimately for that person, generally there are protocols that take more time. And in certain seasons of life, that's something to take into account, that can kind of, make some protocols better than others. And I think the biggest one here, obviously, that we kind of hinted at in the beginning here, is just lifter psychology. And this is something, we talk about a lot, and I think it's something that can't really ever be downplayed. It shouldn't be downplayed, excuse me, because I think this just separates, the way we use certain tools for individuals a ton. So specifically when I'm referring to psychology, I kind of wrote down a few things that I think are applicable here when we're talking about, individualizing protocols or trying to find the best way to achieve a desired training stress for an individual. One of the first things I wrote down was just how does a lifter inherently approach a set. I think this is something we have observed quite a bit, is that depending on somebody's like athletic background or even just the way that they like to train, people can approach sets psychologically very differently. Whether that's being extremely externally hyped up all the way to like extremely internally hyped up. Like there's just like a ton of different variations. People that like to stay more calm, people that like I said, are more on that extroverted end of the spectrum. There's just a ton of different ways that lifters can approach those sets, and ultimately that psychological approach, at least kind of their baseline psychological approach, probably can be taken into account when we're assigning protocols for a given outcome. Obviously, as we've discussed a lot, that's something that can be modified a little bit, but I still think that inherent kind of psychology is something to be aware of. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting, how much this varies even within a sport like powerlifting, for example, where the goal is kind of to lift a heavy load. There's like a pretty wide variation of the things that lifters get really excited about or are motivated by in training. I think the big one that is common with a lot of people that are kind of in that niche is going to be heavy loads, obviously. But I think there's other people, and I've worked with some of them, that just get a high off of like taking a set to failure or just doing sets on reps. And that probably has greater crossover with kind of the physique oriented training community. But I think regardless of strength sport, I think there's going to kind of be certain things that individual lifters get motivated by, and you can leverage that when kind of selecting protocols to make sure we can kind of optimize this quality of work under the curve for a given exercise. I guess I'll stop there, Josh. I don't know if you have anything to chime in before I keep going on.
Yeah, something that came to mind for me is that, like, obviously you're kind of framing this around an individual level, but I also think it can be within an individual across like different time periods of the year in terms of where lifting falls in terms of a priority in their life, as well as just like how they want their relationship to training to be, right? So, like, I actually had a conversation with a lifter a couple days ago, and we're talking about how because we're so far out from competition, and he was going through some work training stuff that required more time and energy. He's like, "Yeah, I want to lift heavy weights, but also just like I don't really want the stress of, like a distinct top set followed by back off works. Like, hey, can we just kind of like maybe take an approach more like 3 sets of 3 to 4 reps at a target RPE, and then if I'm feeling good by that last set, maybe I'll load it up a little bit more and maybe kind of purposely overshoot." Whereas this is the type of lifter that's, pretty driven by top end strength and kind of lives and breathes powerlifting. But during this season of life, it's just a little bit different. So I think these tools, I was just kind of looking through like some recent training blocks I've written while you were talking here, and like it just completely integrated into basically every single training program you write. You just think of like the context of the lifter, what season of life they're in, etc. So yeah, man, keep going, but just wanted to throw that in there.
No, that's a really really good point and something I hadn't really considered. Like you said, I was thinking about this more on the individual level, but even within that, these tools are going to be applicable in different times for that same exact person. And even though there's probably like baseline levels of certain variables that are on the individual level, those can still fluctuate. Had a child, maybe you moved, different job, all those things can move this stuff around. Or you have a meet approaching on the opposite end of the spectrum and you kind of want to turn things up a bit. Obviously all those things are modifiable, so that's a really good point.
I also just thought of another example of when you can also kind of fluctuate this week to week for an individual. So what I have for one of my lifters, and this took us so long to kind of land on, but now that we've landed on it, works so well, is we do all percentage based work that's pretty dang submaximal just because we've ran into some tolerance issues and some aches and pains. But then every 3 to 5 weeks, I'll throw in a pretty low rep, pretty high RP top set. That's basically just like a totally different protocol but it's very infrequent and it's enough to get him excited, right? That one is always on the horizon and close enough to feel like you're preparing for it. But otherwise, we're just kind of, chipping away, getting some good quality work in. So yeah, I think this applies so much more than it like you're almost giving it credit for. So I think this is like a really useful segment. But anyway, I know you have some practical kind of examples to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
into.
yeah. Yeah, just to tie up the kind of the other things about psychology real quick. It's always important to consider, like we said, everybody kind of has that inherent, level of arousal or whatever that they generally approach training to or training with. And I think it's important to kind of know the quote unquote cost of that too. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way to have arousal for training. I think, like I said, a lot of that is just going to be inherent to the individual, but it's just important to realize that, people that get super, super psyched up for top sets, generally, as we've talked about before, that kind of has like this come down afterwards. That's something to be aware of when you're kind of designing protocols. Other individuals, maybe it takes them a while to kind of get, turned up to that point. Get the arousal on point, get their focus on point. They kind of got to get to the gym, warm up the bar quite a bit, get their mind right, and they're not as easily able to kind of turn that extra gear. And I think that also comes along with just people that are just overly aggressive or overly conservative in general. I think that a lot of times is related to psychology as well. That's just something to keep in mind. But like you said, I think ultimately we can kind of look to apply this and kind of think about this in a practical way too. So I just talked about a lot of like conceptual stuff with psychology, like, okay, cool, but like how does that actually influence the way I might do things? So like kind of an example I wrote down we can kind of talk through is, let's say we have like a skill slot. So, when we say skill slot, generally what we're referring to is, again, for somebody that's like strength focused, one of the main lifts that they're trying to improve their 1RM on, either it's that lift or a very close variant thereof. And kind of the goal of that slot or this exercise is to kind of achieve a high peak load, so a high percentage of their 1RM, but still accumulate a good, moderate amount of volume. So again, that's really open-ended, and you can do that a lot of different ways, and none of them are wrong. But based on the individuals that I'm going to kind of give like a case study of here in a second, there may be better tools in each situation. So like, let's take one individual, call them individual A. Maybe they are that person that takes them a while to kind of go there and get their mind right and get them like ready to train. But once they're ready to roll, so like once they do get warmed up and kind of are acclimated to the training session, they do tend to kind of jump the gun and be maybe a little bit too aggressive. So to kind of fit that need of the protocol or the ultimate goal of, again, achieving a high peak loading, but also accumulating a moderate amount of volume, for this individual, it might be, a good idea to use those ramp up sets. So this is something I didn't used to use a ton, and then Josh, me and you talked about it quite a bit. You've been using them a ton, and it's basically just, let's say we have a top set that we want to work up to, or the heaviest weight for the day. Let's say it's a triplet at 8 to 9 RPE. I'm going to do multiple sets of 3 at maybe 1 or 2 RPEs lower than that to make sure that I have to hit the exact same amount of reps to basically prove to myself that I'm willing to take that next jump to nail my RPE for that top set. This is in contrast to, maybe a normal, quote unquote, normal top set approach where maybe just on the sheet I have triple at 8 to 9 RPE and the warm up isn't necessarily specified. I can take singles all the way up to that to really try to maximize the peak load in that first set, which has some theoretical advantages, but at the same time, for many people, that can kind of increase the risk of overshooting because you're not proving that this was 3 reps at RPE 6, this was 3 reps at RPE 7, and now I know, based on the objective performance of those first couple sets, this next jump is very likely to be 3 reps at RPE 8 to 9. And that's a huge advantage of that. And so, but in this situation, I think it has other benefits as well, based on the fact that this person kind of takes some time to get going, maybe needs a little extra warm up to really get that performance maximized. This is going to force additional warm up with some decently challenging sets. As you're doing multiple sets of 3 all the way up, it's going to force some extra warm up that's going to be pretty productive and hopefully get them to really be acclimated once they get up there. Additionally, due to those prescribed sets prior to that, heaviest peak load set, the athlete, in a way, just based on the way his protocol is organized, again, is kind of forced to take those realistic jumps to help with the overshooting. I think that's a huge benefit of doing things this way. And then finally, The one disadvantage of this that you could say is kind of a slight trade-off is it might sacrifice a little bit of peak loading, but encourages a higher overall quality of work for this individual. So it ends up being a net positive. By doing those multiple sets of three, although it's probably minimal, you could make the argument that you're having a little bit of extra fatigue when you go into that heaviest set that in theory may harm the peak load that you're able to achieve. But in this instance, it's probably a net positive because the overall amount of work under the curve is going to be of a higher quality. And if we're doing that day after day, session after session, week after week, that's probably going to lead to the best outcomes as opposed to just chasing, this one isolated peak set that on paper may be more beneficial if we take that relationship to be true. But in this case, I think when you add all the context on top of it, may not be the best approach. So that's kind of that first case study. Josh, any thoughts?
Do you have another example or no?
Yeah, I have one more. If
Yeah,
you want me to scroll into that one.
yeah. Roll into that one, and then I have a few that I just thought of as well. Just I know people
Cool.
like the practical stuff, so
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, this is really just the flip side of things, right? So it's individual B here. This person, let's say they tend to be on the conservative side. They kind of hesitate to give maximal effort, or maybe aren't super well acclimated to kind of knowing, what true maximal exertion is, and they are a little bit, they kind of think forward a little bit, knowing that, man, I don't want to go super hard on this set because I know I got a bunch of work after this that if I go super hard, that's going to be really tough. So maybe I should leave a little bit in the tank. And sometimes this isn't even explicit. It's more like a subconscious thing, that maybe they're leaving a little bit in the tank, kind of like a pacing strategy to kind of just get through the session. In this instance, that's where that top set plus back off approach may be something that's indicated even more so. That's generally kind of a default approach we talk about a lot, but this instance, it may, rather than being neutral, it may be like indicated for, if that makes sense. In which maybe we, instead of having those workup sets of three, maybe we do just to prescribe that top set of 3 reps at 8 to 9 RPE. Then we do that back off percentage of like 10% off the bar and do 2 more sets of 3 after that. In terms of like the rationale there, this is going to encourage that athlete to be aggressive. Basically, we are optimizing the protocol so they can hit the heaviest weight possible for that first top set. And so we really want to communicate that, and hopefully they're able to do that based on the way things are set up. And being aggressive can often be a good thing. Like that's something we want to instill in people so they know how to psychologically approach a heavy set and make sure they're attacking that with a ton of effort. Um, Additionally, this kind of preemptively, is going to lower the load for back offsets to kind of further encourage this individual not to save their effort. The whole point of doing a back offset is we know you're going to exert yourself quite a bit on that top set. That's the entire point. That's the skill of lifting heavy weights. But those back offs preemptively are going to account for the fact that you are going to have a little bit of that drop off in performance. And because of this, the athlete can kind of subconsciously know, hey, it's okay to empty the tank a little bit here because I have this back off percentage that's going to account for the fatigue that's coming. And then the only kind of disadvantage, again, want to pick the pros and cons of all these, that may result in that slight come down effect that we discussed because we are kind of really focusing on that first set. But again, in this case, the point is that trade-off might be worth it because this is going to encourage the highest quality of work for this individual and hopefully get them to really enhance that skill of lifting heavy loads, and maximal strength is dependent on doing that. So that's kind of the rationale in that case. But those are kind of two contrasting examples where, again, the goal of the slot is something extremely similar, but the protocols that may be slightly advantageous in those situations may be slightly different. Just to give those individual context, each piece of that, something to kind of touch on. So, Josh, go ahead.
yeah. I think it's also important to point out that, like, obviously the way the protocol is written is going to inevitably influence the psychological approach, and thus kind of like you said, basically matching the goal of the set to the lifter's headspace, right? But the way it's communicated, whether that's verbally or through email or text message or whatever with an athlete, that can also play a large role as well, right? Or even just like leaving little notes next to protocols. Like, I actually think I stole this from you, Zach, of like, in addition to giving a RPE rating or an RPE target, giving like an arousal target as well. So like red, yellow, or green being like pretty chill, yellow being somewhere in the middle, red being really high arousal. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. But in addition to that, because I know people like I said before, the practical stuff, kind of the nitty gritty examples. I While Zach was chatting here, I have three examples from some of my own lifters of kind of like, I guess, like kind of like some of them are a little bit more creative than others. I mean, I don't think I'm the first one to do any of these. I guess they're not that creative, but nonetheless, hopefully by giving some context about the athlete, as well as how I landed on these protocols, or how I shouldn't say I landed on them, how myself and the lifter landed on these protocols, can really kind of drive home this point before we move on to the next segment. So the first one is, I have a lifter that deals with kind of like some like pec minor slash shoulder tendinopathy. And the kind of general approach we take to their bench press is pretty low peak loads until we're about like 6 to 8 weeks out from a meet or a test. But then once in those initial weeks of reintroducing higher peak loads, I'll program repeat top sets. So I'll do something like a single at 7 followed by another single at 7. But you cannot drop the load for that second single at 7. So that kind of forces the lifter to be honest with that single at 7 and maybe down regulate it a little bit, because they know, they have to do it again, and they have to prove that they can really own that weight at that desired RPE. So that's an example. The second example I have is from a lifter that's a pretty like their femurs are relatively long, right? And squat just beats them up like crazy, and they're the type of person that after a heavy and high RP top set, they just feel pretty smoked, and the quality of the back off work um, is sacrificed a lot. However, after say 15-20 minutes, that starts to come back a little bit. So actually what we landed on, because we wanted those high peak intensity exposures, was kind of a traditional top set protocol, like triplet 8 to 9, like your example, Zach. But then the back off sets, I would give a range of loads for them to ramp up over, say, 4 sets of 5. So they would just kind of feel it out, start on the lower end of things, and then by the last back off set, they're kind of near the higher end of that ballpark load. Just kind of works within the patterns they saw within each slot, while also checking the box of getting, kind of maximizing peak intensity for that slot. The last one I have is from a lifter also on the squat that has a similar issue, in the sense that after doing a hard top set, the quality of the back off work seems to fall. But this is just a slightly different solution to that. It's just doing volume work before the top set. So that volume work typically is not going to be super difficult. It's going to kind of be at the lower end of, I guess, what we would call the threshold for load, as well as proximity to failure to be quote unquote effective. But that can be a way to make sure you're getting quality work in without impacting the performance of the top set much, if at all, and still kind of checking both of those boxes. So those are three examples. Hopefully give the listeners some idea, fuel, and really kind of hammer home Zach's point.
Yeah, it's interesting. We hadn't talked about this before. The first two, I've done the last one as well, but the first two I definitely very recently have done for multiple people. Taking a heavy load for multiple singles, like you said, it just encourages you to have better load selection that's more realistic for
It's a
something
lot
you
harder
actually.
to get away with 2 overshoots.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I've done the exact same things. That's super interesting to hear you say that. And then the other thing too I've done is like I've done a top set like you said, and then the way that I think about it is like ramping back off sets. So you basically replace the ramping sets from the front of the protocol and you put it at the back of the protocol for the very exact same reason that you said. It's for a lot of times for back off work, maybe we're doing a percentage drop or a percentage of estimated 1RM. But for some people, whether it's due to symptoms of like pain or injury or whatever it may be, or just due to, I'd say one thing that I've seen just the widest variation in the world is just like the way that fatigue impacts people, whether that's like within a set and people that can just do an absurd amount of reps or not very many reps at all. Like that research that we talk about, the ability to perform reps at a given percentage, I really feel like that's been something I've observed in my coaching experience that I always think is just amazing. But the reason I kind of came back to that ramping back offset approach was kind of due to a similar reason. I've had a few clients that, generally the way that we kind of set those percentages is you're going after kind of an RPE with those back off sets that you kind of want to be around. Maybe you want to be in a loading range that you kind of, pick reps that make sense at that loading range. But sometimes you generally think that's going to be a pretty consistent thing within an individual, but sometimes it's just not. I have a couple of clients where, 70% for sets of six, maybe totally fine some days, and it's just totally fine. And then the next week, it is absolutely in the garbage can. And, my first initial question is always like, is this a perception of effort thing? But no, sometimes it's legitimately just their repetition performance ability is just way different, even if they're rating that top set accurately, which is something I find super interesting. I don't really know why that's the case, but ultimately we landed on a similar thing, like you said, where putting kind of more auto-regulated protocols via those kind of ramping back off sets where you're starting very conservatively and you can kind of work up as the sets go on, kind of allow you to say, okay, where am I at for today? Let's be really, really conservative for this first set and then work up as we go to get some quality work in. So it's always interesting to not talk about that prior and kind of come to similar conclusions. So that's definitely interesting. But unless you have anything else, Josh, I'll go ahead and read you into your segment.
Go for it, man.
All right. So Josh is going to talk about some recent research on prediction in RAR, but specifically, Josh is going to kind of talk about, there's conversation around when's the best time to rate my RP, in relation to a set. During the set, before a set, after a set. If you're rating it before a set, you're probably doing something wrong, but I guess you could do that in theory. Josh is gonna go through that.
Yeah, so I've been pretty deep into the RP accuracy research lately, and kind of the best meta analysis we have right now is from Halpern and colleagues. I actually think our friend Pack is on this paper. Let me confirm real quick. Yeah, Pack's on this paper.
Yeah,
So,
he's on it. Yeah,
uh,
Milo too, I think.
yeah, I think so. But anyway, there's a really interesting portion of the discussion that just kind of like uh, got some ideas flowing in my mind, and I kind of wanted to connect it to, I guess, some observations I've had as well. So I'm going to kind of talk about some general findings from this meta-analysis on RP accuracy, as well as an additional study that they kind of cited in that discussion. So again, credit to these authors because that's kind of where my ideas are coming from, or at least kind of the idea fuel is coming from. So I've kind of noticed that depending on an individual's background, or kind of like the camp you come from, will kind of influence how they approach this whole RP rating thing. Some will suggest that you should focus on doing the set and just focus on executing the set. And then after the set, after the bar is racked and maybe your heart rate is down a little bit, okay, now you put your coach's hat on and rate the RP after. You don't even think about it until that point, which I think is totally defensible. I do think like some people like to take that side of things because it sounds a little bit more hardcore, more virtuous. But nonetheless, I think there's definitely some points, some good points there, that I'll kind of circle back around to in a little bit. And then other people, and I think this is probably more from like the physique training camp, generally higher repetition work, is that you should treat every set more like an RP stop or an RIR stop. So you stop a set once you feel like you get to the desired number of repetitions in reserve, right? So like a common protocol might be like sets of 8 to 12 at 2 RIR, and obviously you try to select a load that lands you in that rep range at the desired RIR. You might have a target number of repetitions, but if you hit 2 RIR at rep 7, you stop it there. If you hit 2 RIR at rep 13, you stop it there, right? Basically every set's like an RIR stop. Okay. So those are kind of the two camps. And I guess the question I want to attempt to answer, kind of drawing on the research a little bit here, is like which of those is better and when. So from this meta-analysis I mentioned from Halpern, again, we'll link that in the description. It appears that rating RIR intraset. So most of these studies will have subjects rate their RIR intraset, okay, which is kind of more like that second camp I mentioned. Okay. And from that meta-analysis, again, primarily on studies that use interset RAR ratings, they found that RAR ratings are generally pretty dang accurate within about 1 rep of the actual number of repetitions in reserve. So long, like if you kind of take that set to failure and back calculate how accurate that estimation was. Okay. Further, they did some like exploratory meta regressions, and they also reported that accuracy is better if you predict RAR later in a set, right? So in other words, if you have your 12 rep max on the bar, right, and you estimate after rep 6, that's probably going to be a little bit less accurate than if you estimate after rep 9, 10, or 11. Okay, so those are kind of the general principles, general take homes from the RAR rating accuracy research. However, I think it's important to kind of contextualize that research and also, and kind of point out a limitation that is also present in practice if you take this interset RAR rating approach. Okay. So if you predict RAR within a set, it leaves you prone to what's called an anchoring bias, right? So basically, like like I said, most of these studies have subjects report RAR or estimate RAR interset, and in that second example I give, treating everything like an RAR stop, that's basically the same thing, right? So what this anchoring bias is basically when an RAR prediction is made within the set, this can essentially become a goal for the lifter and influence the number of reps actually achieved, right? So you might kind of ask yourself, but they're going to failure, so they know exactly, like, they know truly like what their capabilities are. But I would kind of challenge that, as we've talked about and written about in the past. What failure actually is really hard to define and really hard to get to, right? Even if you have a research group that's doing a really good job of, hey, like if you complete a rep, you need to attempt another one. There's practical limitations there in the sense of like if an individual just grinds through a bench press that's really slow, yeah, maybe they just misgrooved it a little bit and they do have 1 or 2 left. But like if the subject isn't comfortable going for another one, you can't force them to do that kind of thing, right? So anyway, uh, basically the point is like if you are predicting RAR within a set, right, this can create an anchoring bias and potentially hold you back a little bit. All right. So we can pair this with we can pair that kind of concept with another study from Arms and colleagues, which again we'll link in the description. And their study design is really the only one I'm aware of that removes this anchoring bias. Okay. So the subjects did not know that they were looking at RAR accuracy in their study design, but they were still obviously looking at that in their analyses. So the way they did this is they had subjects come in on different days and do leg extensions with 2 different goals, right? So on one day, they came in and they wanted them to complete a self-determined repetition maximum. In other words, they wanted them to go until they felt like if they attempted another rep, they couldn't complete another rep, right? So basically 0 RAR. Then on the other day, they had them go to true momentary failure. On a leg extension, this is much easier than something like a bench press or a squat because, if you complete a rep, no matter how hard it was, you have to go for another one. And what they did is they compared the number of reps completed when they basically went to 0 RAR compared to going to true momentary failure. And they found that on average, obviously there's individual variability here. They found that the 0 RAR or that self-determined repetition maximum, they completed about 2 less reps than when they went to true failure. So in other words, their 0 RAR was essentially 2 reps less than what true failure was. So in other words, they weren't very good at predicting that, right? So on one hand, we have this general concept from the Halperin meta-analysis that rating RAR later in a set is better for accuracy. However, we need to keep in mind that failure is hard to define and those are prone to an anchoring bias. So if you are thinking about RAR within a set, you might kind of, again, hold yourself back because you're anchoring yourself and you're kind of setting your expectations accordingly. Okay. So let's kind of take these two conflicting thoughts and try to summarize them and also have some practical take homes. And then I'll kick it over to you, Zach, and kind of see if there's anything we should clear up. So, um, again, RER accuracy is greater the closer to the set endpoint you make it, right? So if we think about this in practice, that would kind of be a point in the column for thinking about RP within a set and kind of taking that RAR stop approach, because that's going to make your RAR ratings more accurate, and thus kind of make the the training you do more precise, right? But on the other hand, thinking about RAR within a set can create an anchoring bias and potentially hold you back. Okay, so we kind of have two conflicting thoughts here. So my practical kind of message or a general take home would be is that if you're doing sets of about 5 reps or less, which are typically going to be like skill slots anyway, typically going to be like a compound movement, a main lift, whether that's like a squat, a pause squat, tempo bench press, that kind of thing, where you probably want to be focusing on execution anyway. Just focus on completing the desired number of reps and rate the RAR after. I think that's a generally good take home, because again, if not, you might, kind of hold yourself back due to that anchoring bias. But if you're doing sets of about 6 or more reps, right, it's probably better to treat it as an RAR stop, because estimating RAR before the set is probably going to be quite inaccurate because you're so far from, that actual set endpoint, right? So again, practical take home, less than 5 reps or so, focus on execution, then put your coach's hat on afterwards, rate the RPE. If it's greater than 6 reps, think of it like an RAR stop. Again, broad brush strokes here. Obviously, there can be situations where you flip flop those or whatever, but hopefully that's helpful as a practical take home and gives the listeners some idea fuel. But Zach, I'll see if you have any thoughts to add or anything you want to clear up.
Really, the only thing I had, I just more of like a question, or if anybody has a master's thesis project they're looking into, this would be something I would find interesting. This is kind of this conversation at least is contingent upon the primary thing that we want to know being RR accuracy. I wonder how this would actually impact like objective performance. So like one thing that we could do, or at least would be interesting, I don't know if this exists, you know this area better than I do, would actually be looking at velocity of the repetitions at the same load rather than the actual accuracy per se. So like, the accuracy is obviously important and that's something that we want to know. But I think another question would be, okay, here are situations when I'm more accurate, but how does making the actual rating intra-set impact force production? So like if you were looking at the same relative load, you do the arm study where they basically have them come in on different days, and you look at the total, peak force under the curve or whatever with a given load. Does making that call within the middle of a set rather than just taking it all the way to failure actually impact your ability to perform? Like, does that self-fulfilling prophecy of accuracy also impact decrements in performance? I think that would be pretty interesting. I honestly don't know if that has been done, but I think that concept is interesting.
Yeah, I think like attentional focus is huge here, right? Like if you're doing a set of 12 on lat pull downs, you can kind of take a little break,
Yep.
take a little psychological break and get away with that and kind of think about where you're at. Whereas if you're doing, you know, a tempo squat or something, right, for a triple at 8, probably don't want to be thinking after rep 2, how many RIR do I have? That's kind of the main idea, right? And hey, that's a good example of like if you're doing a tempo squat after rep 2, it's probably going to be pretty painful, pretty uncomfortable. You might kind of anchor yourself in a negative way, similar to what they saw in that arm study.
I also just like one thing just from like practical experience, like it seems to me to come from like a competing thing that you want in the front of your mind. We don't really know how important maximal concentric intent is for hypertrophy training, really. But if that's a situation in which you are more likely to have the intraset RAR rating, based on my personal experience, I think it'd be difficult to kind of like simultaneously do both of those, because training with true maximal concentric intent is like takes quite a bit of concern and mental effort. So I find that interesting. Obviously, I'd have to play around with it more. I really haven't thought about this too much till right now, but I think that's basically, to me, it seems like you can really only have like one primary thing that's going to be like something you're really focusing on, and then too many things might dilute the quality of everything. These are just random thoughts. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think no, I agree with that. I just want to make one last point here, which I actually think is an important one, and I don't really want to gloss over, is that um, thinking of RAR within a set, as well as having just a rep target and you try to put the best load on the bar for the desired RPE, those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So, like, you can have a rep target with an RAR stop and kind of like check in during the set to ensure it's going to be close to the target RAR. So, say you're doing high bar squats, is kind of like an intermediate between some skill work, some specific practice, but also trying to accumulate like a good amount of volume for the quads to hopefully stimulate some hypertrophy, right? And say you're doing sets of 6 to 10, something like that. I think it's okay to check in. I think it's okay to say, okay, if the desired RR is 3 here, I think I'm going to get about 8 reps with this load. And then after the 5th or 6th rep, be like, do I still think 8 reps is reasonable? Okay, cool. Let's go to 8. And then I'll put my coaching hat on afterwards and make sure I was still correct. So again, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? Like the way I'll typically, or not typically, but a good amount of protocols I write will use a percentage of estimated 1RM and then have an RER stop. So you don't even have to prescribe the number of reps necessarily, but you can still have the lifter can still have a rep target, right? So like in general, they know that at a given percentage of their estimated 1RM at a given RER, okay, this is about how many reps I'm going to get. I'm going to shoot for that, but I might check in 2 or 3 reps beforehand and just kind of make sure that's reasonable and it's not totally off the rails. And it's going to lead me to be at like way more RR than I want to be, or lead me to accidentally fail on the extremes. But yeah,
That's almost always how I like to use it for hypertrophy work, is like, based on prior week's performance, I kind of go in with like my, you know, beat the logbook kind of performance that I'm after, but I have my RR target, and that's kind of like the off switch of like, all right, I'm trying to get 12 reps, but I hit 10 and I hit my RER target. I'm like, probably should cut the set there, as opposed to just, maybe I get to my performance target after the set. I realize that my RER was higher than the target. That just means I can progress further. That's usually the way I like to do it for hypertrophy work. So I totally agree with that. Definitely
yeah,
not mutually exclusive. And there's going to be situations in which you kind of want to use all three kind of situations you
yeah,
described, probably.
yeah. Just as like a super concrete example of that, I literally did the exact same thing. What was it? Oh, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago now. We got back on a red eye flight, so I didn't sleep that night, and then I went straight to train, and I had 8s on squat, and the target RIR for the top set was 3. Got to that, I got to that like 6 rep, and I was like, no way, Jose. So like that's an example of like most of like I was trying to beat the logbook. I felt like I could do it, but then after kind of checking in during the set, I was like, if I try to get to 8 reps here, that's going to be like a 9.5 to a 10. Um, which obviously there's a time and a place for that. I'm not saying like overshooting is always bad, but within the context of not sleeping and traveling and that kind of stuff, it's like, okay, let's just, stop at the desired RER. Generally would prioritize that over the rep target, especially with a set of 8. Make sure, feel good going into next week and beat the logbook that week. So anyway, I think with Isaac's question about training splits, we should leave the listener at the edge of their seat and save that one for next episode.
Sounds like a plan.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We will see you in episode 34. Take care.